The auctioneer's hammer came down like a verdict. $1. Laughter erupted across the yard, sharp and mean, the kind of laughter that sounds like stones being thrown. And I stood there in the September mud, a 16-year-old orphan in a dress 2 sizes too small, watching strangers bid on the bones of a dying town, while my 12-year-old sister gripped my hand so tight I could feel her pulse against my palm. That was the day I bought the only thing nobody wanted. The sovereign mind had collapsed that spring, not with the drama of an explosion, but with the quiet surrender of timber supports giving way deep underground. No men died, which meant the investors back east felt no guilt when they pulled their money and told everyone to clear out before winter. Most people did, the smart ones anyway. My name is Ren Ashford, and I was not smart, I was desperate. There is a difference, though it took me 22 years to understand it. The auction happened on a Tuesday in late September, 1887. Iron Hollow, Montana, spread below the slag heaps like a wound that refused to close. The main street had already lost half its storefronts to abandonment. The saloon still operated, barely. The general store hung on because people still needed flour and nails, even when they had no money to pay for them. My sister Posey and I stood at the back fence, as far from the crowd as we could manage without actually leaving. She was 12, small for her age, with our mother's dark hair and our father's stubborn chin. Her hand trembled in mine, though whether from cold or fear I could not tell. At my heel sat Flint. I'd a wolf dog we had found half-starved near the rail spur 3 months earlier. He had amber eyes and gray-brown fur, and a way of watching strangers that made them keep their distance. Which was good, because strangers in Iron Hollow did not want to get close to us anymore. Our parents had died in the spring flood, trying to cross the river to fetch medicine for Posey when she was burning with fever. The water took them both. We found their bodies 2 days later, tangled in the willows downstream, still holding hands. I was 15 then. Posey was 11. We had no family, no money, and no one who wanted us. What we had was a reputation. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne made sure of that. He stood near the auction platform that day, tall and thin in his black coat, watching me the way a hawk watches a mouse. He had arrived in Iron Hollow 3 years earlier, preaching hellfire and redemption to miners who needed both. He had a voice like thunder and eyes like winter ice, and when he spoke, people listened. What he spoke about, increasingly, was us, the Ashford girls, the cursed ones. It had started as whispers after the flood. Bad luck follows that family. Then louder, after the mine collapse. Everything went wrong when they came, and louder still, after the summer sickness that took 4 children from the valley. Those girls brought it. Everyone knows. We had not brought anything except our grief. But grief does not matter when people need someone to blame. The auction moved through its catalog of despair. Ore carts sold for decent money. Kegs of blasting powder went to freighters heading west. Draft horses, ribs showing through winter coats, were bid on like they were the last useful things remaining in the valley. They probably were. The auctioneer wiped his hands on his vest and cleared his throat. He was a tired man doing a tired job, eager to finish and get back to wherever home was. Final lot, old mill structure on the west bank, damaged wheel, no operating value, sold as is. Nobody moved. The mill had been there before the silver boom, back when Iron Hollow ground grain and cut lumber for ranch valleys instead of pulling ore from rock. Years of neglect and spring floods had done their work. The wheel was split and slumped into the shallows. The roof sagged like a broken spine. The foundation had shifted until the whole structure tilted slightly, like a drunk trying to remember how to stand. No takers? The auctioneer looked around, his voice flat with resignation. Anyone? Starting bid, $10. Silence settled over the yard like dust. $5? Nothing. $1. Someone give me $1 for this property. Posey's hand tightened on mine. Flint pressed against my leg. I felt the weight of everything we had lost and everything we were about to lose. We had been staying in the boarding house on Main Street, paying with the last of our parents' savings. That money ran out last week, Mrs. Carpenter had told us, apologetically, that we needed to leave by month's end. She would not meet my eyes when she said it, and I knew why. Reverend Thorne had visited her, told her what happened to people who sheltered the cursed. We had nowhere to go, no family to claim us, with no one willing to take in two orphan girls that half the town believed had brought the mountain down on their heads. I raised my hand. $1. The laughter started immediately. Boone Callahan, who owned the saloon, laughed so hard he had to grab the fence to keep from falling over. His face went red, then purple, and he pointed at me like I was the best joke he had heard in years. "The orphan girls bought the ghost house," he howled. "Perfect match. Cursed children in a cursed building." Others joined in. Men who had known my father. Women who had brought casseroles after the funeral. Children I had played with before the whispers started. All of them laughing, their voices rising into the gray September sky like crows taking flight. I kept my eyes on the auctioneer. "Sold," he said and dropped his hammer. "To, what's your name?" "Shubba Miss." "Wren Ashford." More laughter. But the hammer had fallen. The paper was signed. And suddenly I owned 340 acres of riverbank, a broken water wheel, and the only roof in Iron Hollow that no one else wanted. Posey pulled at my sleeve as we walked away from the auction yard. Flint trotted beside us, hackles slightly raised, watching the crowd watch us. "Wren!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What did you do?" I tucked the deed into my coat pocket. My hand brushed against the other thing I carried there, the thing I had not shown anyone since our parents died. Our father's notebook. Edmund Ashford had been a millwright before he came west. He had learned the trade in Pennsylvania, building water wheels and sluice gates and gear systems for mills that ground grain and cut lumber across the Allegheny valleys. He treated it like a language, one he had taught me since I was old enough to hold a pencil. His notebook was full of sketches, wheel paddles at precise angles, flow calculations in careful ink, notes on head and drop, and the thousand small adjustments that made the difference between a wheel that turned and a wheel that sat still. I had carried it since the day we buried him. "Wren," Posey's voice cracked. "What are we going to do?" I looked at her, 12 years old, thin from a summer of grief and not enough food, scared in a way that children should never have to be scared. I thought about the boarding house that would not have us, the town that blamed us for its misfortunes, the winter that was coming, cold and merciless, caring nothing for whether we had a roof or not. "They want us to die," I said quietly. We are going to live instead." The mill looked worse up close. We walked there that same afternoon, following the river road through yellowing cottonwoods until the structure came into view. It sat on the west bank, where the current ran strong, perched on stone foundations that had been set by someone who knew what they were doing, even if that knowledge had faded from living memory. The wheel was the worst of it. 8 feet in diameter, oak and iron, half its paddles missing, and the rest warped like old shingles left too long in the rain. It hung at an angle, the axle visibly bent, the lower section dragging in water that ran brown with autumn silt. The dam upstream was not much better. Stone and log, solid work once, but years of floods had gnawed at it until water spilled through gaps like fingers reaching through a broken fence. The building itself sagged, roof half collapsed on the north side, windows broken or missing entirely. A family of raccoons had taken up residence in what used to be the grain storage, and they watched us arrive with the suspicion of longtime tenants. Posey stood beside me on the bank, looking at our new home. She started to cry. Silent tears at first, then deeper sobs that shook her thin shoulders. I wanted to cry too. I wanted to sit down in the mud and weep for our parents and our future and the terrible mistake I had just made with our last dollar. I wanted to be 15 years old and scared, which is exactly what I was. Instead, I opened our father's notebook. I looked at his sketches of wheel paddles and dam faces and sluice gates. I looked at his calculations about flow rates and head drops. I looked at his handwriting, just steady and precise, The handwriting of a man who believed that problems could be solved if you understood them well enough. Then I looked at the mill, and I saw what others could not see. The drop at the bend was still good. About 4 feet of head over 50 yards, enough to turn a wheel if the dam held. The main posts were sound where they met stone, solid oak that had weathered a generation without rotting through. The race channel could be cleared. The river was stubborn, yes, but stubborn things were worth building with. "It is not a ruin," I said quietly. Posey sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "It looks like a ruin. It looks like parts." I crouched down, running my hand over a foundation stone. Granite, set deep, unmoved by years of flooding. Father would have called it a project. Said the bones were good. "Father is dead." The words hit like a slap. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I stood up and pulled my sister close. She was shaking, crying into my shoulder, and I let her because she needed to, and because I could not afford to cry myself. One of us had to stay standing. "I know," I whispered into her hair. "I know he is dead, but what he taught me is not." That night we slept in the least damaged corner of the mill house, huddled together under blankets we had carried from the boarding house. Flint lay across the doorway, amber eyes gleaming in the darkness, guarding against whatever might come. Sleep would not find me. I lay there listening to the river, to Posey's breathing, to the creak and groan of a building that had been abandoned for years. I thought about the laughter at the auction, about Reverend Thorne watching us with those cold eyes, about the winter that was coming, the snow that would pile up, the temperatures that would drop until breath froze in the air. I thought about dying here, 2 girls and a dog in a collapsed building that nobody would bother to check until spring thaw revealed our bones. Then I opened my father's notebook again, tilting it toward the moonlight that came through the broken roof, and I started to plan. The first thing we needed was the dam. I started work the next morning, before dawn, while frost still silvered the grass, and my breath came out in white clouds. Posey was still sleeping, curled tight under every blanket we owned. Flint followed me to the riverbank and sat on a rock, watching with those amber eyes that missed nothing. The dam was 30 feet across and maybe 6 feet tall at its highest point. It was built the old way, stone faces filled with rubble and clay, log cribbing to distribute the force of the current. Half of it was still solid. The other half had been eaten away by years of spring floods until gaps ran through it like wounds that would not heal. I had no money to hire workers, no draft animals except Russet, our chestnut mare, who was 17 years old and not suited for heavy hauling. No tools except what I had found in the mill house and what I could scavenge from the abandoned mine buildings up the slope. What I had was time and stubbornness and my father's notebook. I started with the stones. The riverbed was full of them, washed down from the mountains over centuries, rounded and smoothed by water until they fit together like puzzle pieces. I waded into the shallows and began dragging them to shore, one by one, my hands going numb in the cold water, my skirts soaked and heavy. I stacked them on the bank until I had a pile as tall as my waist. Then I climbed to the damaged section of the dam and began fitting them into the gaps. It was slow work. Each stone had to be chosen carefully, tested for how it would sit against its neighbors, wedged and shimmed until it locked into place. I packed clay into the seams, digging it from the bank with my bare hands, pressing it into every crack until my fingers ached and bled. The town watched. I could feel their eyes from across the river, from the road that passed above the mill, from the windows of buildings that had a view of the West Bank. And they watched me wade into cold water and haul stones and pack clay until my hands were raw. They watched and they waited for me to fail. Some of them came to make sure I knew they were watching. "Building a beaver lodge?" Boone Callahan called from the road one afternoon, a week into my work. He had 3 men with him, all of them grinning like they had front row seats to a comedy show. "Going to charge fish rent?" Silence was my only answer. I kept working. "Water does not care about hope, girl." This was Gideon Holt, who had been the timber boss at the Sovereign before it collapsed. He stood with his arms crossed, watching me struggle with a stone that weighed nearly as much as I did. That wheel is busted and winter is coming. You are wasting your time. I finally got the stone into position and began packing clay around it. Yeah, then I am wasting my time, not yours. He spat into the dirt and walked away. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, watching. The real trouble came in the second week. I had been working on the dam for 10 days, making slow progress, when I went to the general store to buy nails. I needed them to repair the mill house roof before the first real snow arrived. I had trade goods, dried fish, and a basket of late apples from trees growing wild on our new property. Widow Opal Sutridge, who ran the store, would not look at me. "I am sorry," she said, her eyes fixed on the counter. "I cannot sell to you." "Cannot or will not?" "Cannot." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The Reverend was here yesterday. He said anyone who helps you will share your curse. I am sorry, Wren. I truly am. But I cannot risk it." I stood there for a long moment, looking at this woman who had known my parents, who had come to our cabin with bread and sympathy after the flood, looking at the fear carved into her weathered face. "I understand," I said finally. I picked up my basket of apples and my string of fish and turned to leave. "Wait!" Widow Sutridge glanced toward the windows, checking that no one was watching from the street. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a canvas bag that clinked with metal, along with a short iron pry bar, well used but solid. "Back door," she whispered. "After dark. Do not let anyone see you." I looked at her face, at the courage it took for her to defy a man who terrified her. "What do you want for them?" "Teach my son to use that pry bar without breaking his foot. Well, he needs a trade." So I taught another boy too. That was how it started in Iron Hollow. Not with speeches or arguments or grand declarations, but with trades that carried respect in their pockets, passed through back doors when no one was watching. By late October, the dam was holding. I had spent 6 weeks hauling stones and packing clay, cutting deadfall logs and lashing them into a new face where the old one had rotted away. My hands were permanently chapped, the skin cracked in places that would not heal until spring. My back ached in ways I had never imagined a back could ache. I dreamed about water every night and woke up reaching for stones that were not there. But the dam held. The race channel came next. It had silted up over the years until it was more mud than water, clogged with debris and the accumulated neglect of a decade. Aunt Posey and I spent a week digging it out, shoveling silt into buckets and hauling it to the bank. Flint watched from the shore, occasionally barking at fish that swam too close to his rock. Then the wheel. I dismantled it paddle by paddle, laying each piece on the bank, numbering them with chalk so I would remember how they fit together. The hub was split beyond any hope of repair, so I went looking for timber to replace it. I found it on an abandoned claim up the canyon, a single thick log half buried under pine needles. It was 6 inches across at the narrow end, nearly a foot at the wide, straight-grained and solid. I hitched Russet to a makeshift sled and dragged it down the slope, while Flint trotted alongside like a sentry escorting precious cargo. I owned no proper plane, so I made do with a draw knife and patience. So I shaved the hub smooth over 3 days, checking roundness with a string looped around it, marking high spots with chalk and shaving them down until my arms burned. I drilled bolt holes by hand, bracing the bit with my knee, turning until my forearms shook with the effort. Josiah came to watch one morning. He was 14, the son of a miner who had left for the new strikes in Colorado without bothering to bring his family along. His mother had died of the summer sickness that everyone blamed on us. He was living in an abandoned cabin on the edge of town, eating what he could scavenge, trying not to freeze before winter really arrived. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Building a wheel." "Why?" I kept shaving, the draw knife biting into wood. "Because winter does not care if I give up." He watched me work for a while longer, his thin face thoughtful. Then he said, "I could help, if you wanted." I looked at him, thin, hungry, scared. Not so different from Posey, really. Not so different from me. "I can pay you in food," I said. and I will teach you the work." He nodded slowly. "That seems fair." Micah came the next day. He was 15, Josiah's cousin, abandoned by the same circumstances for the same reasons. I gave him the same offer. He accepted without hesitation, so we became four. Two orphan girls and two abandoned boys, building a water wheel while a town waited for us to fail. The first paddle went on in early November. I held it in place while Josiah tightened the bolt, keeping my voice steady despite the cold that had seeped into my bones. "Do not over-torque," I warned. "You will split the grain." He blinked, confused. "Over what? Too tight? Nah, wood needs room to breathe." He repeated the phrase later like a joke, sharing it with Micah while they ate the stew I had made. But he also did exactly what I said. 24 paddles, evenly spaced, each one angled to catch water without slapping it away. It took us 2 weeks of careful work. On November 12th, 1887, snow laid a thin skin over the valley. The trees had gone bare, their branches reaching toward a gray sky like hands asking for help. The river ran cold and clear, fed by snow melt from the high peaks that ringed our little valley. I opened the gate. Water rushed into the race channel, hitting the wheel with a sound like a gasp of surprise. The paddles caught it, lifted it, released it. The wheel shuddered, groaned. The axle, which I had straightened as best I could with fire and hammering, protested loudly. And then, slowly, the wheel began to turn. Inside the mill house, the main shaft rotated for the first time in years. It vibrated through the boards like a pulse, like a heartbeat, like something that had been sleeping for a very long time and was finally waking up. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt motion where there had been only rot. Posey was crying again, but this time the tears were different. Josiah's mouth hung open in wonder. Micah whispered something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. Flint sat on the bank, amber eyes watching the wheel turn, and I could have sworn he looked satisfied. "All right," I whispered. "Now we make you useful. If you have been following along this far, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to build something from nothing when no one believed you could succeed? Or have you ever been told you were cursed or broken or finished? Tell me your story in the comments. And now let us see what happens when the first winter really tests what Ren has built." My first lesson at the mill was that water work was never finished. It was only held day by day against what the river wanted to take back. I learned to read small changes in the current. A new swirl where a stone had shifted overnight. A deeper sound where water had found a gap in the dam. A slight hesitation in the wheel's rotation that meant something was catching somewhere beneath the surface. I carried a short stick marked in inches. Every morning before breakfast, I planted it at the same spot below the dam and checked the level, writing it down in my father's old account book because it was what I had. September 18th, water 2 inches below mark. September 25th, water at mark, dam holding well. October 3rd, level high after rain, east edge leaking. When the east edge leaked, I walked the bank and found where the current pressed hardest against the stone. I set larger stones there, ugly ones, heavy ones that fit like teeth into a jawbone. I packed willow branches and gravel behind them to slow the seep. Then I tamped clay again, palms raw from the cold. Josiah asked why I bothered writing the levels down. "You can see it," he said, shrugging like I was making extra work for no reason. I showed him the book. Seeing is one thing, remembering is another. Winter will make you forget what normal looks like. Paper does not forget. He stopped arguing after that. The saw blade came from the sovereign's leftovers. Most of the mine machinery had been sold at auction, but a worn circular blade lay in the scrap pile, ignored and rusting. 28 inches across, good steel, just dull and spotted with corrosion. I traded potatoes and flour to Caleb Vance, the blacksmith, to retemper it. Caleb had been my father's friend once. Guilt made his eyes dodge mine whenever we crossed paths, and it had been that way for months since the flood. When he handed me the sharpened blade, sparks still fading from the forge, he cleared his throat like he wanted to say something important. "Careful setting it," he managed finally. It will bite if you are careless. So will winter. By early December, the mill could cut lumber. It was not pretty. Patched tin on the roof where I had run out of proper shingles. A carriage built from wagon rails salvaged from the mine. Eight bearings greased with tallow that I had to replace every few days. But when I fed the first log into the blade and the wheel drove it through clean and straight, I felt the kind of satisfaction that grief could not diminish. Boards meant walls. Walls meant shelter. Shelter meant survival. I offered lumber cheap, $2 for enough boards to patch a leaking roof, $5 for a full wall's worth. If folks had no cash, I took trade. Beans, nails, labor, whatever they could spare. Some people scoffed at the arrangement. "No one is staying," Gideon Holt said when he heard about my prices, like leaving was a virtue and staying was foolishness. "Then leave," I replied calmly. "But not everyone can afford to go." A handful of families could not afford the journey back east. When a few farmers were testing valley soil because land was cheap when silver was gone, shopkeepers stayed because their lives were nailed into their walls and they could not imagine starting over somewhere else. They bought boards. Quietly, Iron Hollow began to change shape. Not back into a boom town, but into a place where work existed. A place where surviving seemed possible again. Spring came like an enemy. The snow melted fast that year, faster than anyone expected. By late March, the river was running brown and angry, swollen with debris from the high country. Logs and branches rushed past the mill like battering rams, spinning and crashing through the shallows. I watched the water rise and felt fear settle into my stomach like a cold stone. The dam had been built for normal flows. This was not normal. And this was the mountain emptying itself all at once, trying to wash away everything in its path. On a night in late April, Flint woke me with a sound I had rarely heard from him. A low growl, continuous, urgent. The kind of sound a wolf makes before a fight it knows is coming. I grabbed my lantern and ran. The river's roar had changed. It sounded angry, hungry. At the dam, water foamed over the spillway in a torrent that threw spray 20 feet into the air. And there, caught against the face like a lever, was a log as long as two men laid end to end. It had wedged itself into a gap between stones and was working back and forth with the current, prying at the dam with the full force of the flood behind it. If it shifted wrong, it would take half the dam with it. And then the wheel, the mill, everything I had spent months building, gone. However, I did not have time to run for help. By the time I reached town and returned, the damage would be done. The river was happening now. I waded into the water. The cold hit me like a fist to the chest. Knee-deep, then thigh-deep, the current pulling at my skirt, trying to drag me downstream into darkness. I grabbed a rock and held on, inching toward the log, the water roaring in my ears so loud I could not hear my own thoughts. Posey appeared on the bank, lantern in hand, her face white with fear. "Wren, get out of there!" I could not answer. I was too busy trying not to die. The log was massive, waterlogged, slippery with algae that had grown on it during years in some upstream pool. I looped a rope around it and tied the other end to Russet's harness. The old mare stood on the bank, ears flat, but she held steady when I called to her. "Why pull, girl, pull!" Russet leaned into the weight. The rope went taut. The log shifted, scraping against stone with a sound like bones grinding. And then Posey slipped. She had come too close to the edge, trying to help, and the mud gave way beneath her feet. I heard her scream, saw her tumble into the flood, watched the current grab her and drag her downstream like a rag doll. Time stopped. I let go of the rope and dove. The water was a monster, all noise and cold and force. I could not see Posey. I could barely see anything. I swam toward where I had last seen her, fighting the current with everything I had, my lungs burning for air. Something gray-brown shot past me in the darkness. Flint. He caught Posey by the collar of her dress, his jaws locked tight, paddling with everything he had against the flow. I reached them. He grabbed my sister, felt her hands clutch at me with desperate strength. We made it to the bank, barely. Posey coughed and gasped, spitting river water onto the mud. Flint collapsed beside her, panting, his fur plastered flat with river debris. I knelt there shaking, cold so deep it felt like my bones had turned to ice. Behind us, I heard a sound like a gunshot. The log had broken free. It shot downstream like a spear, tumbling end over end, crashing through the shallows until it disappeared around the bend. Water slapped hard against the dam, but the stones held. The dam held. I sat on the bank, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely think. Flint pressed against me, wet fur and warm body, the best kind of comfort. Posy curled against my other side, crying with relief. "We survived the water," she said quietly, to her voice hoarse from coughing. "We can survive anything." Flint sneezed as if agreeing. The next morning, Gideon Holt showed up without being asked. He stood on the bank, squinting at the dam, his face unreadable. Whatever mockery had lived in his expression before was gone now, replaced by something that might have been respect. "Heard the river tried you last night," he said. His voice was rough, but the cruelty had left it. "It did." Gideon kicked a stone with his boot. "You need a log boom, upstream, catch debris before it hits the dam." I watched him carefully. This was the man who had called me a fool, who had told me the wheel was worthless and winter would kill me. "Will you build it?" His jaw worked. Pride fought practicality in his weathered face. Practicality won. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I will." That was the first day he stopped being a skeptic and became something else. Not quite an ally yet, but no longer an enemy. Summer brought growth. The sawmill ran steady enough that I could think beyond patching roofs. I started keeping accounts on a slate, then transferred them into a proper ledger each evening. Board feet per day. Waterhead needed to keep the blade from bogging. Bearing grease frequency. My average cut was around 450 board feet when the logs were straight. Less when knots fought the blade. I learned to set aside the worst boards for crates and the best for walls. Waste was another word for hunger in our house. Settlers began passing through, bringing news from other valleys. Coal prices rising, freight routes delayed by weather, a boom town 2 ridges over already drying up and blowing away. And I listened without comment. Trends mattered less than systems, but I adjusted. I built a small storage shed beside the mill and raised it 2 feet off the ground on stone piers to keep spring moisture from rotting the floor. I cut vents under the eaves so air could move through and dry the lumber stacks properly. I showed Josiah and Micah how to sticker boards, placing thin spacers between layers so they would not warp while curing. Josiah grumbled at first. Then he admitted the board stayed straighter. "Why does nobody else do this?" he asked one afternoon. "Because doing something right is slower at the start. Most folks quit before it pays off." Then Reverend Thorne struck. It happened on an October night, 2 weeks before the first anniversary of my buying the mill. I woke to Flint's growl and the smell of smoke. If the lumber shed was burning, orange flames climbed the walls, casting wild shadows across the riverbank. Smoke poured into the sky, thick and black, blotting out the stars. The heat reached us even from the mill house, 100 feet away. I screamed for Posy, for the boys. We ran with buckets, but it was hopeless. The fire was too hot, too fast, too hungry. All we could do was keep it from spreading to the mill house itself. Posy tried to save a stack of boards we had spent a week cutting. She grabbed them and pulled, and the fire reached out and caught her sleeve. I heard her scream, saw the flames climbing her arm, tackled her into the mud and smothered the fire with my own body, rolling us both in the wet earth until the flames died. Her hand was burned, not badly enough to threaten her life, but enough to blister, enough to scar, when enough to cause pain that would last for weeks. I bandaged her by firelight while the lumber shed collapsed into ash behind us. "Who did this?" Josiah demanded. His face was black with soot, his eyes wild with anger. I knew who had done it. I had seen 3 figures running away as we came out of the mill house. 3 figures in dark clothes, moving toward the road that led to town. "It does not matter," I said. "Does not matter? They burned everything. They hurt Posy." I looked at my sister's bandaged hand, at the tears drying on her cheeks, at the ash that had been a week's worth of labor. If I accuse them, Thorn will say I am lying. He will say the cursed girl is trying to cause trouble. And people will believe him because they want to believe him. And because believing him is easier than believing us, I stood up and looked at the smoldering ruin of the lumber shed. Tomorrow, I said, we start cutting again. Josiah stared at me like I had lost my mind. That is it? They burn us and we just keep working? That is exactly it. I met his eyes. They want us to quit. They want us to rage and scream and give them a reason to drive us out. So we do not quit. We do not rage. We just keep building until they run out of things to burn. Posey reached up and took my hand with her unbandaged one, her grip fierce despite the pain she must have been feeling. We survived the water, she said quietly. We can survive the fire. I almost smiled. Yes, we can. The next morning I was back at the saw blade feeding logs into the cut. My hands were steady, my face was calm, and then somewhere in Iron Hollow, people who had heard about the fire began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong about the Ashford girls. January 9th, 1889, the day the winter tried to kill us all. I remember the color of the sky that morning, the color of old tin, of worn-out hope. Clouds so low they seemed to press against the mountains, squeezing out what little light remained. Wind rose before noon, not the usual mountain wind, but something else entirely, something mean and hungry. Snow began falling sideways, fine as ash, slipping through every crack in every building in Iron Hollow. By evening, the telegraph line went dead. By midnight, the world outside my window was a solid wall of white, as if God had decided to erase us from existence. I slept in my clothes. Flint lay against the door, his body a barricade against whatever might try to come through. At dawn, I checked the thermometer nailed to the mill house wall, minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold that froze spit before it hit the ground, cold that made wood snap and iron sting like fire against bare skin, cold that turned pride and stubbornness into luxuries no one could afford. I harnessed Russet anyway. She was old, nearly 19 now, but she stood steady while I fumbled with frozen buckles, my fingers too numb to feel what they were doing. Flint pressed close, his fur already rimed with frost. The path to the mill was nearly invisible, but I followed the willows by memory. Snow had drifted against the wheel shelter, piling up in sculpted waves that reached the eaves. Ice had thickened in the race channel, despite the straw I had packed around it. The wheel was turning, but barely. The paddles slipped against ice instead of catching water. If the wheel froze solid, the mill would die. And if the mill died, so would everything I had built. I chipped ice with a hammer until my arms shook. I cleared the gate and opened it wider to force more flow. Water resisted, thick as syrup, but it moved. The wheel shuddered, caught, began turning with more authority. Questions could wait. Winter could not. And then I heard shouting through the wind. Boone Callahan came staggering down the bank, hat gone, face raw and red from cold. Behind him came two other men, supporting a third who could not walk on his own. "Wren!" Boone's voice cracked with panic. The Thornberry cabin roof caved in. Snow came through. Two little ones trapped inside. Ach, they will freeze. I did not ask why Boone had come to me instead of someone else. I did not ask why he was not at the saloon, warm and safe. I did not ask any of the questions that a smarter person might have asked. Winter did not care about questions. "Bring them here," I shouted back. "Bring the family to the mill house. It has walls. Move!" The men dragged Tobias Thornberry through the snow. He had fallen through his own porch and done something terrible to his ankle. His wife and children stumbled behind, wrapped in whatever they had grabbed when the roof came down, their faces blue with cold. I lit every lantern in the mill house and hung them from the beams. Flint came in last and lay down beside Tobias, amber eyes steady, lending calm by sheer presence. Caleb Vance pulled off his gloves with shaking hands. "The roof is giving way," he said through chattering teeth. "Whole north side. They need proper shelter or they are finished. I looked at Tobias Thornbury. He had been loud about the Ashford curse, had told anyone who would listen that we brought bad luck to Iron Hollow, had laughed at the auction when I bought the mill. Now he was pale and shaking, terrified for his family, helpless in a way that stripped away everything except fear. I felt no satisfaction, only urgency. I turned to Gideon Holt, who had followed the group in, snow crusting his beard white. "Help me clear the saw carriage," I said. "We cut boards now." He stared at the storm howling outside the mill house walls. "In this? Unless you want to nail snow to their roof." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "Tell me what to do." For hours, the mill became a factory of survival. I fed logs into the blade, my hands steady despite the cold that had seeped into every part of my body. Gideon and Caleb hauled fresh boards inside so they would not crack from frost. Boone and Josiah carried lumber through the storm to the Thornbury cabin, where men with frozen fingers nailed it over the cave section of roof. The wheel turned. The dam held. The river, stubborn beneath its skin of ice, did what it had always done. It kept moving. Near dusk, Boone paused beside me. His face was gray with exhaustion. His hands, even in thick gloves, were shaking badly. "We laughed at you," he said. His voice was raw with more than cold. "I did. Called you cursed. Said you had lost your mind." I kept feeding the saw because stopping was not an option. "Save the apology for later. Use your hands now." He nodded and went back to work. By nightfall, the Thornbury roof was patched enough to keep snow out. The family was moved to Boone's saloon, where a wood stove still threw heat. Tobias's ankle was splinted as best as Caleb knew how. The storm raged on for 2 more days, but the immediate death, cold rushing into a broken home, had been pushed back by boards cut from a wheel no one had wanted. When I finally shut the gate and packed extra straw around the race channel, Flint pressed against my leg with solid warmth. I looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds as the storm finally died. I understood then what I had bought at the auction. Not a ruin, a heartbeat. If you have made it this far, thank you for walking through that blizzard with me. I want to know, have you ever helped someone who once hurt you? What made you decide to do it anyway? And have you ever seen a crisis bring a community together in ways no one expected? Share your story in the comments. Now let us see what happens when spring comes and everything Wren has built faces its final test. After that winter, Iron Hollow's mockery did not disappear entirely, but it softened into something more useful. Respect. Gideon started showing up with wagon loads of rock for the dam face, gruffly pretending he had thought of the improvements himself. Caleb sent iron bolts and scrap metal without charging a cent. Boone began telling every freighter and settler who passed through that Iron Hollow could supply lumber without waiting on coal shipments from the railroad. And then the farmers came. The valley soil, ignored during the silver boom, proved better than anyone had expected. Rich bottomland along the river. A good drainage. Enough growing season if you chose your crops carefully and said your prayers when frost threatened. Mrs. Larkin was the first to bring me grain. She was a widow in her 50s, hands swollen with arthritis, face weathered by years of hard work and harder loss. She carried a sack of barley over her shoulder like it weighed nothing, even though I could see the tremor in her arms. "I cannot grind it by hand anymore," she said. "My wrist will not allow it. If the wheel could manage." I looked at the sack, then at her, then at the wheel turning steadily in its race, reliable as a heartbeat. "The wheel can drive more than a saw," I said. Adding grinding stones meant rethinking everything. A saw blade wanted speed. Grinding stones wanted steadiness. If the stones ran too fast, they would heat the grain, spoil the flour, or throw sparks into dust. And flour dust, I knew from my father's warnings, could explode like gunpowder if conditions were wrong. I built a new gear train over the course of that spring, a large wooden gear on the main shaft, meshing with a smaller pinion to reduce speed. I used oak for the teeth because it wore better than pine. I soaked them in boiled linseed oil and let them cure for 3 days, the smell sharp enough to make my eyes water. Gideon taught me how to set iron collars and fit a bearing cup so the stone spindle would not wobble. If it wobbles, he warned, it will eat itself. Then it will not wobble. The governor came last. Two weighted arms mounted on a vertical shaft, swinging outward as speed increased. The faster the stones tried to spin, the more the weights lifted, on pulling a linkage that closed the gate slightly. Simple physics, centrifugal force, though no one in Iron Hollow used those particular words. I called it the rule because it kept the mill honest. I tested it with no grain first, just letting the stones hum against each other. I adjusted the linkage with tiny turns, a quarter inch at a time, until the sound settled into a low, even purr. Then I poured in barley. The first flour came out coarse, too much bran, so I tightened the stones. The second run came out too hot, so I eased the speed and widened the gap. By the fifth run, the flour was pale and fine, warm from friction, but not burned. Mrs. Larkin pressed it between her fingers like it was snow fallen from heaven. Her eyes were wet. "This is bread," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "It is grain," I corrected gently. She shook her head firmly. "No, it is winter made softer." In June of 1889, matched granite grinding stones arrived from the rail spur. 4 feet across, 8 inches thick, nearly a ton apiece. They cost $65, money I had saved board by board, sack by sack, trade by trade, for over a year. Half the town came to watch them roll into place. When I opened the gate and the stones began to turn, when grain poured between them and emerged as flour, warm and fine and real, something shifted in Iron Hollow that would never shift back. The Ashford girls were no longer cursed. We were necessary. The investors arrived in September. 2 men in clean coats rode into town from the rail spur, their horses fresh, their boots polished to a mirror shine, their hands soft as a child's. They asked questions at the general store. As they walked the main street with the careful attention of buyers assessing merchandise, they found me at the mill with flour dust on my apron and numbers in my head. Miss Ashford, the taller one, Caldwell, had a voice like oiled leather. "We represent certain interests back east who are reconsidering the potential of this valley." "The silver is gone," I said. "Has been for 2 years now." "Indeed." The shorter one, Pruitt, smiled like a cat watching a mouse it intended to eat. "But silver is not the only thing of value here, is it? Water, timber, arable land, and a mill operation that seems to be remarkably functional." I understood then why they had come. They wanted what worked. They always did once it was proven. "We would like to make an offer," Caldwell said smoothly, "to purchase the mill operation. Cash, of course. You could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere with fewer memories." I looked at them, at their clean hands and their calculating eyes, at the way they held themselves, like men who expected to be obeyed without question. Behind them, I saw a shadow in the crowd that had gathered to watch. Reverend Thorne, thin and dark in his black coat, watching without speaking. He had done this, contacted them, brought them here. One last attempt to drive out the cursed girls. "No," I said. Caldwell blinked, clearly unaccustomed to that word. "I beg your pardon?" "No, I am not selling." Posey stepped up beside me, her scarred hand resting on the ledger shelf. She was 17 now, no longer the frightened girl who had cried at the sight of the ruined mill. She had learned to keep the accounts, to calculate board feet and flour yields, to negotiate with farmers who tried to underpay. "My sister speaks for both of us," she said quietly. Her voice was steady as stone. "This mill belongs to Iron Hollow, not to men who arrive after the work is done." Pruitt's smile sharpened, but I caught his eyes flicker to her burned hand, then away. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, at least. "Then name your price," he said. I stepped to the ledger shelf and pulled down my account book. I opened it to a page of figures. Board sales, flour contracts, repair labor, traded. I did not hand it to them. I just let them see it existed. "I can sell you this mill," I said. or I can sell you the output of it for 20 years. One of those options keeps Iron Hollow stable. The other makes it dependent on you again. Caldwell frowned. Dependency is inevitable in business. I shook my head. Dependency is a choice people make when they stop building what they need. I pointed toward the riverbank, toward the wheel turning steadily in its race. You want transport rights on these roads. You want supplies without delays. You want a town that can keep your crews fed if you decide to dig at that mountain again. My eyes narrowed slightly. Then you sign my terms. Pruitt's face went cold. And if we do not, then you ride back to the rail spur and tell your investors the valley is not ready. My voice stayed calm. And I keep cutting boards while you find somewhere else to gamble. It was not bravado. It was truth. And truth was heavier than any threat they could make. Reverend Thorne stepped forward from the crowd. You cannot let this child dictate terms, he said. His voice carried across the yard, commanding attention the way it always did. She is cursed. Everything she touches turns to ash. The fire, the floods, the mine collapse itself. All of it traces back to the Ashford family. You are making a deal with disaster. I watched him speak. This man who had turned a town against two orphans, who had burned my lumber shed, who had made my sister afraid to walk down Main Street for months. I waited for the anger that should have come. It did not. What came instead was something quieter, something older, the kind of calm that settles in after you have survived enough storms to know that words cannot hurt you as much as winter can. Boone Callahan stepped forward. He was not a hero. He was a saloon keeper with a loud mouth and a weakness for whiskey. He had laughed at me at the auction. He had called me cursed to my face. But his children were alive because of boards cut from my wheel in a blizzard. Shut up, Thorne. His voice was rough, almost angry. Just shut up. Thorne turned, startled. Brother Callahan, I am not your brother. Boone's hands were shaking, but his voice held steady. These girls saved my children. They worked through a storm that would have killed anyone else. They cut boards and hauled them through snow while you sat in your church and prayed. He pointed at Thorne with a finger that trembled with old fear and new courage. You call them cursed. They are the only reason half of us are still alive. Silence fell over the yard. Then Gideon Holt stepped forward. I called her a fool when she bought this place. Said she would be dead by winter. I was wrong. Caleb Vance nodded. She gave me work when the mine closed. She traded fair when I had nothing to offer but my skills. I owe her more than I can repay. Josiah stepped forward, no longer the hungry 14-year-old who had wandered to the mill looking for purpose. He was a man now, 20 years old, skilled with saw and plane, engaged to a farmer's daughter from down valley. She taught me everything, he said, gave me a trade when my own father left me behind to starve. Micah nodded beside him. Same story for me. We would be dead or gone without her. Widow Suttridge from the general store stepped forward with tears on her weathered cheeks. She taught my boy a trade, kept him out of trouble, gave him purpose when I could not. Mrs. Larkin, with flour still dusting her hands, raised her voice. She gave me bread when I could not grind my own grain, gave me winter made softer. One by one, where they stepped forward, the people who had bought boards and flour, the people who had traded labor for goods, the people who had been helped quietly without fanfare, while a 16-year-old girl built something from nothing. Thorne looked around. His face went pale as old bone. He had spent 3 years building fear, 3 years convincing people that the Ashford girls were cursed, 3 years wielding his voice like a weapon against children who had done nothing wrong. And now that voice meant nothing, because actions were louder. Actions lasted longer. Actions could not be shouted down or explained away. The crowd parted, leaving Thorne standing alone in the middle of the yard. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He turned and walked away, his black coat disappearing down the road toward the rail spur. He did not look back. He never returned to Iron Hollow. The investors signed. They signed contracts for lumber supply, 20-year terms with prices fixed and obligations mutual. They signed agreements for transport rights that included road maintenance and bridge repairs at their expense. They signed clauses protecting the riverbank from reckless digging and requiring consultation before any new mining operations could begin. They signed because they had no choice, and because I think they respected what I had built despite themselves. Iron Hollow did not return to a silver boom. The sovereign mine stayed quiet, its head frame standing against the sky like a broken rib, a reminder of what had been and what had failed. But the town endured, small, stubborn, working. In the years that followed, people sometimes said I had been lucky, that I had gambled and won. That fate had smiled on the Ashford girls. I never corrected them. Luck was what people called it when they saw someone succeed without their permission. Epilogue, 22 years later. Winter of 1910. Iron Hollow was still cold, still isolated, still carved into the valley like a choice someone had to keep making every single day. But it was no longer empty. A schoolhouse stood where abandoned cabins had once sagged, built from lumber cut by my wheel, with windows that let in light even on the darkest days. Posy taught there now, her scarred hand moving across the blackboard as she wrote lessons for children whose parents had once called us cursed. She had married a farmer's son named Thomas, and they had 2 children of their own who sat in the front row of her classroom. A modest depot loaded flour and boards bound for points west. The main street stayed dusty in summer and buried in snow come January, but the buildings were solid, built to last, built by people who had learned that permanence mattered. Josiah ran his own lumber operation now, 2 valleys over, using everything I had taught him. He came back every spring to help with the high water, bringing his sons to learn the same lessons their father had learned as a hungry boy of 14. Micah had married Widow Suttridge's daughter and taken over the general store. He still called me Miss Wren, even after I told him 100 times he could use my first name without the title. Boone Callahan had died 3 winters back, peacefully in his sleep, which was more than most men who drank as much as he did could hope for. His son ran the saloon now and kept a photograph of the 1889 blizzard on the wall behind the bar, with a plaque beneath it that read, "The night the Ashford girls saved Iron Hollow." Caleb Vance still worked his forge, though his hands shook now and his eyes had gone dim. He had made the iron fittings for the schoolhouse doors, refusing payment, saying it was the least he could do after everything. I was 38 years old that winter. My hair had gone silver at the temples, which made me smile at the irony. Silver had killed this town once. Now it grew on my head like a badge of survival. My hands were still calloused. My back ached on cold mornings, and some days it took me longer than I liked to straighten up after bending over the millstones. But my posture remained straight, built by years of refusing to fold. Flint had died of old age years before, buried under a cottonwood tree above the mill. I still visited his grave when the snow was not too deep. I still talked to him sometimes, telling him about the wheel, about the flour contracts, about the apprentices who came from other towns to learn the trade. Beside me now trotted his granddaughter. Ember, we called her. Gray-brown fur, amber eyes, the same watchful steadiness that Flint had carried all his life. Russet was long gone too, buried beside the barn she had called home. But her grandson stood in the yard, a chestnut gelding as practical and patient as the first. The thermometer on the mill house wall read -29 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the wheel turned in a rhythm so familiar it felt like breathing. The grinding stones hummed their constant song. Sacks of grain waited in a neat line, each marked with a farm name that had not existed when I bought a ruin for $1. A group of apprentices, young men and women from down valley towns, stood near the gearing, listening as I explained the mechanics. I taught them because I believed what my grandmother had believed without knowing it was philosophy. Knowledge is not like gold. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. One girl with strong arms and curious eyes asked the question they always asked. "Is it true nobody wanted this mill?" My mouth curved slightly. They wanted it. Once it worked. "Why did you buy it when it was ruined?" I looked past her, through the slats of the mill house wall, at the river running dark beneath its shell of ice. I thought about my father's laugh before the flood took him. Hanoi about the careful ink in his notebook, each letter formed with the precision of a man who believed in getting things right. About Flint's silent loyalty at my heel through the worst storm of my life. About the night they threw us out of the boarding house, two girls alone in the rain with nowhere to go. I thought about Posey's burned hand and her stubborn courage. About Josiah and Micah, who had been abandoned boys and became skilled men with families of their own. And about Mrs. Larkin crying over flour as if it were a miracle. I thought about Boone Callahan standing up against Thorne after years of going along with the crowd. About Gideon Holt admitting he had been wrong. About a town that had called us cursed, learning to call us neighbors. I answered simply, because when the rush ends, the river remains. Behind me, Gideon Holt, now old now and leaning heavily on a cane, cleared his throat. He came to the mill most days still, not to work anymore, but to watch, to remember, to be part of something he had almost missed. I called you crazy, he said. His voice was rough with age. I was wrong. Gloating was not my way. I nodded once. Most people are wrong before they are right, I replied. Cold teaches faster than words ever could. Gideon gave a short laugh. It certainly does. After the apprentices went home, after the last sack was loaded onto the wagon bound for the depot, I walked up to the cottonwood tree above the mill. Ember followed, her paws quiet on the snow. I brushed frost from Flint's worn stone marker and stood listening. Wheel creak, river murmur, river. The steady sound of something that did not care about silver prices or investor telegrams or the opinions of men in clean coats. Warmth was precious on the frontier, so was purpose. Posey had asked me once, years ago, what I would have done if the wheel had not turned, if the dam had washed out, if the winter had won. I had not answered then because I did not know. I knew now. I would have tried again, found another way, built something else, because that was what the river taught me. It did not stop when it hit a rock. It went around, over, through. It kept moving because movement was its nature, and nature did not negotiate with obstacles. Neither did I. The valley wind cut sharp against my face. But inside the millhouse, there was motion, and motion meant survival. Iron Hollow was not saved by luck. It was not saved by miracles or prayers or the kindness of strangers who appeared from nowhere. It was saved by the one thing that stayed after the rush ended. Two orphan girls who refused to die, a wheel that refused to stop turning, and a river that would flow long after all of us were gone, carrying our story downstream toward the sea. Thank you for walking this entire journey with Ren and Posey. If their story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories about hope, about second chances, about finding strength when everyone else has given up on you. I want to hear from you. What did this story teach you? Have you ever had to rebuild from nothing while people watched and waited for you to fail? Have you ever found family in unexpected places or discovered that the things others threw away were exactly what you needed? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else who is struggling right now, someone who needs to know that the river remains even after the rush ends. Until next time, remember what Ren learned in that frozen valley. Obstacles are not endings. They are invitations to find another way. The river never stops. Neither should you. The end.